Thank you, gentlemen. Excellent. So we were talking just offline prior about the paradoxical state of the markets right now. And I thought it would be good to start with just your take of where do you think we are in this market? We know about the demand for some of the raw materials. We here believe in the sort of importance and the utility of mining. But does the generalist investor, does the institutional investor, have they woken up to that at the moment? And where are we actually at in the market? And Clive, why don't you start us off? I'll put you on the spot. Thanks.
Right, good morning all. So we're following Evie, which is always entertaining. We were talking about this, so I'm not surprised it's the first question. I think we're in a really interesting sort of juncture right now. We all know that the world is warming up, and we all know that we need to do something about decarbonising. We've got COP28 around the corner. Everyone's going to be focused on decarbonisation. How do we achieve that 1.5 degree scenario? Now, I never thought, as an investor in natural resources, I would turn into a climate change specialist. It's 20 years of doing this, and I never thought that would happen, but it has. And we've had this long period where people are like, yeah, we kind of get it, but yeah, it's going to be like the same thing as always. I think now what you're starting to see is a generation of investors that are waking up to the reality that without mining, there is no solution to climate change. Sorry, there's people all the way over here. So I always like to say that when it comes to combating climate change, achieving 1.5, all the good things we want to talk about, mining is part of the solution, not the problem. And we've gone in the last 3 years, I've been saying this to our investors from, thanks, Clive, I get it, but come back next year, to now getting phone calls from the same people saying, what was it you said 3 years ago? Because we kind of need to revisit that. And it surprises me, and I will stop, I promise, it surprises me the scale of institutions that are only just waking up to this as a topic. But it's exciting because suddenly we've gone from being the team that sits in the corner of the building and no one wants to talk to us and the lights don't work, to suddenly being in the middle of the floor and I'm having to tell people to go away. We've actually got funds to run. We can't keep just doing your things for you. So it's really exciting, but we're not quite there yet. But I do get the feeling we're on the cusp of this change, and it will all be driven by that news flow you see in the headlines, the unfortunate news flow around climate change and extreme weather events.
I'd probe you a little bit further on that, around the security of supply challenge, and as a sort of another overlay, because of supply chains realigning themselves, the China-US trade war dynamic, and then also some of the wars that we've got unfortunately going on in the world today. How does that play into this? Not just the sort of climate agenda, but also where am I going to get these materials from for my renewables, for my batteries, etc.?
So it's probably the single biggest thing, or one of the single biggest things we're trying to figure out. Mother Nature didn't put the things in the places we really want them. And even when they did, like the US, you're still spending a decade plus attempting to get a project like Resolution, which is critical. Don't forget, copper is a critical material to US security of supply, and it still can't get permitted. I mean, it's madness. In terms, I think the things you've talked about, the extreme weather events, the wars, everything that's the negatives we're seeing is starting to move towards a positive resolution. People are starting to consider, how do we re-onshore? If we re-onshore, where do we get the cement or the steel or the copper or the aluminium to build the infrastructure we need to make our battery plants? And governments are starting to very slowly wake up to the fact they don't want to be beholden to other countries for their energy security, or where they can, their raw material supply. And I think what's really interesting, that the awful events of last year and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, people have now started governments have started looking left and right and saying, do I trust you? Are you going to do something that's a bit silly that means I'm not going to get my supply of X? And therefore, do I have that supply? Can I get it from an alternate source? At the same time, the countries that supply that material are realizing they have a precious commodity, even more precious than it ever has been. And therefore, how much value can they extract? So there's this sort of push-pull going on between countries that supply, who want every dollar or whatever the currency is of income they can get from it, at the same time as those countries that need it are saying, well, hang on, I'm not going to pay up for it more than I should, but I will be a guaranteed off-taker for you, and I'm a safe person you can send it to.
And I think what's really interesting there as well, if I may, is building on that, this emergence of ECAs getting much, much more prevalent into at least the mine finance side of the business, where you have countries around the world, the DFC out of the US is a good example of it, who are going out and helping developing countries build projects. And historically, ECAs have been primarily centered around equipment provision for construction, but now we're seeing a lot of off-take guarantees as well. So if you want to build a copper mine and you want funding from the US government, sell your copper to a US company that's going to bring that material into the country, and we'll give you dirt cheap debt to do so.
Yeah, is that really coming in significant enough volume that's going to help our industry? We always talk about being starved of capital. Equity markets are in a challenging point. What's the view from Orion, on the private capital side of things? And are you feeling some of the same conversations with your investors that Clive's mentioned already? More people knocking on the door, getting ready to position?
Yeah, I think so. Look, the equity markets right now in our space are not very good. I won't sugarcoat it. It's quite tough. We invest across the capital structure, but when we do go out and do a full mine finance package, we do like there to be a component of third-party equity, so we're not the lender of last resort. I would say, in the most recent raises, we're still seeing the usual suspects making up the greatest portion of the register. Starting to see more generalist funds coming in, starting to wake up to the thematic, like Clive mentioned. But I'd sure as heck like to see a lot more of it and make my life a lot easier.
Yeah. What do you think some of the blockers are? Is it people have been burned before in previous cycles? We hear that a lot. Is it a cautiousness of not really fully understanding the dynamics of the
I think
mine?
it's a lack of understanding.
Yeah.
I think it's a lack of education. I think it's an outdated attitude towards mining and the culture that mining brings. We were talking before that you're much more likely to get injured in an Amazon warehouse these days than at a major mine site, right? Because the ESG and the governance that this industry is employing over the past 5, 6, 7 years is so much better than it has been historically. And that's obviously for the better for a variety of reasons. We just need to, help educate the generalists a bit more as to what we're doing and why it's different than it has been in the past.
But that data's there on the ESG side, right? It's presentable, it's packaged up maybe. So it's sort of, do you think that there's still caution around the nature of the industry, the extractive nature?
Yeah, I think so. I think, I'm sure this is what Jamie spoke about on the last panel, packaging up the ESG and presenting it in a digestible manner. I just think it takes time. It's not an overnight. You can't change someone's mind overnight, unfortunately.
It's a mindset. Okay.
I think, and don't forget that as an investment, we're fighting with the tech industry. And someone gives you a shiny new piece of tech and everyone goes, "Ooh, I want that." Someone gives you a great big, mine site with a big dump truck. It excites me, but a lot of other people go, "Nah, not interested." And so it is that perception issue, but it's changing. It is evolving. People are starting to understand that you need this and you can actually invest in our asset class and do good.
Yeah.
Just to say, I think another thing to consider here is that the uncertainties abound when it comes to investing in this space. So you're not just looking at the commodity cycle, you're looking at very undefined and potentially very long permitting cycles, if you'll get the permitting at all. So, that's quite a significant risk to consider. Then there's talent. We're sort of losing people continually. The number of mining degrees, engineering degrees, and so on is just falling. Whereas in China, you've just got it growing. So when you layer everything together, it becomes a lot more difficult to make that investment for the generous investor, at least.
Yeah. Okay. Do you have any other comments on some of the points around this realignment of supply chains, Tao, and the security of supply narrative? What's that doing to you as investment manager in terms of the projects that you look at?
Yeah, so I think the US is way ahead of anyone here. They've got it right, I think, in terms of both creating a system where they are incentivizing new supply through the Inflation Reduction Act, or Inflation Creation Act, as some people are calling it. So you've got incentives coming into play there, but then also direct funding. So they've put in nearly $200 million into a new LFP plant that ICL are building. They're giving direct grants from either the infrastructure bill to Talon, who's developing a nickel project, or even giving money straight out of the US Department of Defense. So they've really got it set up, whereas what I see certainly in Europe is aspiration that's not matched by actual action. So Europe is using the stick rather than the carrot. And I'm not sure that they're going to get there, given the energy disadvantage that they have. High energy prices are not conducive to competing with China, for example. And I think there's perhaps an aspect here that needs to also be considered, which is not just about the supply of minerals. Actually, if you look at the last 10 years, the supply of most critical minerals has expanded. If you look at the US Geological Survey, there's more nickel, there's more cobalt, there's more lithium, there's more rare earths. It's not all in China, whereas sort of 70% of the reserves of rare earths were in China 10 years ago. Now it's sort of half that number. Higher prices are encouraging new supply to be discovered, at least. I think where the real issue is in processing. We're just seeing, regardless of what the commodity is, almost 90% of it is being processed in China. And that needs to change, particularly for the overall environmental footprint to improve, for the security of supply to improve. We're finding these materials in a much more diversified set of countries now. But it's really the processing, I think, that needs to be focused on to assure security of supply.
Yep. And the US is more willing to embrace that reindustrialization, that sort of midstream processing piece, than Europe, as you described. But how do we tackle that processing risk? It's more capital again. It's more being more comfortable with taking on these heavy industries.
I think there needs to be just an awareness that there are going to be some trade-offs here. Actually, to build a processing facility costs much less than it does to build a mine. The time it takes to build a processing facility is much shorter. But what you need is quite complicated equipment. You need to have skill sets that are haven't been developed and invested in for a long period of time. And what they might perhaps offer is opportunities to partner with China in ways that are different. Rather than buying processed materials from them, let's get them to come over and provide, as part owners of businesses here, spheronization technology for graphite, or purification technology for graphite, or other processing aspects which they're pretty good at, but they can't then just stop supplying it if the plant's built here. In fact, they have an incentive to keep producing it because they maybe are co-owners. So I think that might be an interesting way to proceed.
Let's talk a bit about China risk then. G's just had a visit over with Biden. We're talking about the processing capacity that China still retains. What's your view as investors in terms of what the world needs to do now? Do we need to sort of patch things up with China and start smoothing things out, or is it going to continually? This is going to be the sticking point, really. Clive, I don't know if you've got. How do you see China?
I can see you looking. No one country is going to solve this. And Charles eloquently said, we need China as a partner in all of this. We need all countries to be a partner. All 197 countries and different entities all need to work together to achieve this 2050 target. And it needs to happen with all the bits in the mining chain. I said earlier on, Mother Nature doesn't put the resources where we want them. So if you've got your copper in Chile, but you've got a refinery in Europe, you need to ensure you've got security of supply lines going back and forwards. If China's got a technology that can help us process that copper more efficiently, we should be using it. And this is the change that's going to happen, whether it's provision of capital, technology, whether it's movement of materials. But the flip side to that is that even if we don't want to go down that route, and we go down the re-onshoring route, which is what the US is doing, that's still incredibly materials intensive. And I think people forget that we all look down this line and say, more electric vehicles, more green power, more traditional uses of the raw materials, such as copper. We mustn't forget those. But there's the flip side to it, which is that actually, if we bring all that technology, all those plants onshore, we've still got to build the physical infrastructure to manufacture, supply the power, house people, bring in, goods and services. And all of that is incredibly materials intensive. It's gone slightly off topic, I know, but the point I wanted to make right from the very beginning was we need every actor to be playing together. It's a big ask, but we're going to have to do it.
I would love that to happen. I think it's a bit of a stretch, but it maybe to some extent it can. But what I think we're seeing as a consequence of this onshoring is a bit of what I'd call like a bifurcation of many of the metals markets, right? So you have your China price, and then you have your Western price, or you have your green price, your green premium, and then your, maybe dirty price. I don't know, lack of a better term there. So I think a good example, really, if you look at like something like the high purity manganese market, there are a number of, projects outside of China which are being built or being developed, but there really aren't anything producing outside of China. So you have this China price, and then you're going to have a European price, a North American price, et cetera, to incentivize these projects to come online. Otherwise, they're just uneconomic. I mean, high purity manganese in China trades at levels that would make none of the DFS stage projects outside, in the Western world feasible. That's just the fact. So with this onshoring, with the security of supply, I think you're going to see a lot of bifurcation in a number of these very niche metals. I mean, rare earths could be another example as well. I mean, graphite now, tungsten even, with all this, announcements coming out over the past couple of weeks.
I think you can see that with some of the more mainstream commodities as well. You're seeing it with aluminium.
Nickel,
copper eventually, a copper mine run on green power using ships with sustainable, low diesel sulfur fuel. Suddenly that material can get a premium.
Okay, we haven't got too long left before we delve into some questions, but we want to talk about what's your views of the junior mining tier of the companies that we've got here. How are they performing? What are you interested in at the minute? Maybe why don't we start with valuations? How undervalued is this sector at the moment, and what's interesting you as an investor? Tom, do you want to take us off?
Deeply undervalued, I would say. What interests me most is really projects which are located where it's going to be a little bit easier to attract capital, where regulatory environments are a little bit friendlier, or at least getting a bit better, or where governments have realized that they need to do things a little bit differently. So, for example, Quebec, I think, is a great venue for looking at projects. It's rich in resource. There's a lot of hydropower. There is funding available from the massive pension funds that they really want to use to direct and grow GDP and grow employment. It's close to the US car industry, right across the Great Lakes, and it's able to benefit from the incentives that I mentioned earlier that the Inflation Reduction Act is bringing in. So I think that's a really interesting area. I think Northern Europe, Scandinavia, whilst permitting is pretty tricky, it is doable, as we've seen recently with a recent graphite project that was awarded its permits despite some local objections. There's a lot of renewable energy there. There are governments that are predisposed towards helping companies reduce the financing burden. There's a European Investment Bank that can sort of come into play. So those would be two areas I personally find quite interesting for juniors to be developing projects.
And largely around this energy metals, battery metals focus as well. Yeah,
mainly looking at lithium, graphite, which has been mentioned, we think is particularly interesting at the moment, particularly given that China is not only producing 90% of the world's graphite, a lot of it is from synthetic coke, which is a high carbon footprint, but they've also just told everyone that they don't want to be exporting it without permits from the 1st of December, which is really causing everyone to sharpen their pencils on all those projects that we've been seeing out there.
Gentlemen, what's interesting right now? Yeah.
Look, I think, I mentioned this onshoring and this bifurcation of the market. I think any material right now, because I really do see that, at least for the near term, that is going to continue. Any sort of energy transition connected material that China has a dominance on, if you can get, your hands on something ex-China and ride the market, I think that's very attractive. So there I'm thinking, as I said, high purity manganese, rare earths, graphite, things like this that I think the Western world is really starting to wake up to their requirements for.
Clive, kind of probe you on commodities right now, or is it the whole sec?
In terms of
What's interesting for you right now? You mentioned copper a lot.
yeah, the whole thing. I think the entire market cap spectrum is undervalued, underappreciated, and underowned. And I think people are genuinely waking up to that. In terms of the commodities, graphite, yes, but I think aluminium, copper, nickel, possibly a little bit more neutral on at the moment. But even some of the raw materials like iron ore that go into the steel industry, old school classic commodities, everyone pushes them to one side when we think about lithium and manganese and rare earths and all the sort of fun stuff that builds cars my kids want to own. Not the thing I drive. But when you look at the world, that entire commodity spectrum looks fascinating.
You need a lot of steel to build a wind turbine.
Huge amount. I can give you the stats.
One other thing I just want to mention is I think this idea of being self-sufficient is a bit of a pipe dream. I don't think any country can ever hope to be self-sufficient, realistically speaking, in what they need. And what we don't see enough of, and which I think we'll see more of, is stockpiling. China has been stockpiling critical minerals for the longest time. The US is a strategic petroleum reserve. I think we'll increasingly see that happen, if not in individual countries, clubs of countries doing that. And that just serves as, sort of another demand source for metals, which keeps prices high, which will hopefully help a lot of the companies here get projects over the line if we do see sustained higher prices.
Well, this year we've seen Japan, Australia, the US and Europe all talking about critical material stockpiling. It's exactly that point.
Yep. Okay. A few minutes left. Does anyone have any questions for our panel while we've got everyone on stage?
Just a quick one on, well, there's lots of talk about China. India, I think, is the most populated country in the world. India never seems to come up in dispatches. Views from the panel on where India fits in over the next 10 to 15 years?
I would love to say that India will come through with lots of demand. It's a story I've heard many times in the last 25 years of doing this. Maybe now is the time it will come through, but it's a pretty difficult place, I would say, to do business in the first place. And I maybe I'm just carrying too many battle scars, but just a little bit skeptical of the India story. I wouldn't want to be in India today after the defeat yesterday. It'd be pretty grim place, but putting that aside.
Cricket aside.
I'm probably more optimistic. Lots and lots of challenges, but given the timescales we're talking about, given what we have to achieve by 2050, I think India will be a source of demand, but not the way we're thinking about it. You need new thinking when you come to countries like India.
What about uranium? We chatted a little bit prior. We know what the price has done this year. We're talking about COP28 coming up. Nuclear's, politically challenging, but the green credentials of it are realised. What's the panel's view on sort of uranium spot market at the moment, and then also projects?
I love uranium. I think it's great. I think what a lot of people forget is the word transition and energy transition, right? There's not just a switch you can flip and everything be completely green. We need to work to get there. And I think uranium can be sort of that bridge, that stopgap, if you will. I think historically, there's obviously been a lot of bad press and bad stuff associated with uranium and nuclear power. I think that's in the past, hopefully. And I think that the tech on the generation side has come a long way in the past decade. We're probably still looking at 10 years to build a full nuclear reactor and probably 10 billion capex overrun. But there's smaller facilities and smaller generation technology that can be employed now that can really make a difference in my mind.
Do you think that capex is slowing it down? Perhaps, and we know China's building out a lot of reactors, etc., and they're bullish on it, but the capex is sort of what's slowing down projects coming into actual
they seem
production.
to always finish things on time and on budget in China, so I don't know.
Yeah. Yep. Okay, excellent. Does anyone have any other? There's a question at the back there.
Hi, Fiona Clouder, the Ambassador Partnership. What do companies want governments to do, and what's needed to make that happen?
Permitting?
I guess it depends what stage, what kind of company. So are we talking, are you in exploration? Are we talking development, getting your studies? Are we talking a proper producing mine? What? All of them. Well,
Solutions, maybe different solutions for different categories of companies.
Yeah.
But ultimately, the industry's got to move together on this.
I think sorry, go on.
Well, I think there's a few things companies would want to see. One is ideally direct investment or some sort of grant funding programs, either through state-owned enterprises or in partnerships, procurement programs, which we've mentioned, to offer guaranteed sources of demand to get projects over the line, streamlining permitting and project development processes, helping with talent development, innovation funds. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. This is not there's no silver bullet here, unfortunately. But I think governments could do a lot more, particularly in streamlining project development and perhaps some direct funding.
Okay. Well, look, one last question quickly, Mr. Banningle. Yep. 1 minute to go.
It seems we've got a three-way clash here potentially between geopolitical, national security concerns, climate change agenda, and financial market stroke costs. Who wins?
Is it a trilemma you're talking about?
Red and green. Does there have to be a winner? Can they all win?
I think, ironically, established producers will win because the only real way out of this is higher commodity prices to create the appropriate incentives to get all this over the line. And if you've already got projects going, you're just going to benefit from those higher prices. So that would be the first winner, I would say. Of course, there'll be projects that emerge, that go over the line, and lots of value to be created. But I'd say the first winners will be existing producers.
I'll add on to that the small caps with the really high quality projects that might struggle with the financing, they'll be winners in the sense that the larger companies will come in and help, and you're seeing that happening. But you're going to have to give up some value potentially to do that.
Okay, fantastic. Look, we could go on. That's really, really insightful and too short, really. But thank you, gentlemen, very much for your insights this morning.
thank you.